The moment that conference room door opened, I thought my company was finished. I had spent nearly 10 years building Walker Dynamics from a rented garage with one folding table, two secondhand laptops, and more determination than experience. Every late night, every rejected proposal, every dollar I chose to invest instead of spend had led to this morning. 22 investors sat around the polished oak conference table inside a downtown Chicago office overlooking the river. Some represented venture capital firms. Others were private investors who had built successful businesses of their own. If everything went well, I would leave that room with enough funding to take my company nationwide. My name is Ethan Walker, and at 41 years old, I believed I had finally reached the biggest opportunity of my life. The presentation had been moving exactly as planned. The first few slides explained our growth. The next showed customer retention numbers that had exceeded every forecast. I could see people nodding as I answered questions with confidence. Richard Bennett, the lead investor, leaned back with his hands folded, watching every detail without revealing much emotion. Sarah Collins, my business advisor, sat quietly near the end of the table, giving me a small, encouraging smile each time I finished another section. Everything felt steady, controlled, earned. Then the conference room door slowly opened. At first, I assumed it was an assistant bringing coffee or updated paperwork. Nobody looked toward the entrance immediately, because meetings like this were always busy. But when I noticed several investors suddenly shifting their attention away from me, I turned around. Standing in the doorway was Mason Carter, my wife's younger brother. He wasn't wearing a business suit. He wasn't carrying a laptop. Instead, he stood there holding a small black USB drive in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't frightened either. It looked like someone who had spent days deciding whether to do something difficult. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Even the quiet hum of the projector seemed louder than before. My first thought wasn't confusion. It was disappointment. Why today? Out of every day in the year, why now? Mason and I had always gotten along. When he lost his first job, I helped him rewrite his resume. When he struggled to pay rent after moving to Chicago, Olivia and I let him stay in our guest room for nearly 5 months. I introduced him to people in my professional network and celebrated every small success he achieved afterward. He wasn't just my wife's brother. I honestly thought of him as family. Richard Bennett finally broke the silence. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly, "do you know this gentleman?" I looked at Mason before answering. "Yes," I replied. "He's family." Richard nodded once, but didn't say another word. The room waited. Mason didn't move closer right away. He simply looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he quietly said, "Ethan, I'm sorry for interrupting, but if I wait until this meeting ends, it may be too late." Those words settled over the room like a heavy cloud. My pulse quickened, but years of building a business had taught me something valuable. Panic solves nothing. I placed the presentation remote on the table, took a slow breath, and walked toward him. "Can this wait 15 minutes? I asked softly enough that only he could hear. Mason glanced down at the USB drive before looking back at me. "I wish it could," he answered. "I really wish it could." I searched his face for any sign that this was some misunderstanding or harmless mistake, but all I saw was quiet determination mixed with genuine regret. Behind me, 22 investors remained completely silent. Every eye in that room had shifted away from financial projections and toward the unexpected moment unfolding at the doorway. I realized that whatever happened next would probably be remembered far longer than any slide I had prepared. At that moment, I believed Mason had just walked in to destroy everything I had spent 10 years building. I had no idea that the truth waiting inside that tiny USB drive would challenge everything I thought I knew about my business, my marriage, and the people I trusted most. For a moment, nobody moved. Richard Bennett looked from me to Mason without saying a word, while the other investors exchanged brief glances that revealed curiosity more than concern. I knew every second of silence made the room more uncomfortable, and I also knew that people investing millions of dollars paid close attention to how a founder handled unexpected pressure. My instinct told me to ask security to escort Mason outside, but something in his eyes stopped me. He was not acting like someone trying to embarrass me. He looked like someone carrying a burden he never wanted to deliver. I turned toward the investors and smiled as calmly as I could. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. Please give me just a minute." Richard nodded once. "Take your time, Mr. Walker." I stepped into the hallway with Mason and gently closed the conference room door behind us. The sounds from inside disappeared instantly, replaced by the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. We stood there facing each other for several seconds before I finally spoke. You picked the worst possible moment. Mason lowered his eyes. I know. Then why are you here? He tightened his grip on the small USB drive. Because if I waited until after your meeting, the people inside that room might make decisions they deserve to make with all the facts. I frowned. What facts? He hesitated, then slowly shook his head. I cannot explain everything out here. You have to see it yourself. I looked at the envelope in his other hand. It had my name written across the front in black ink. Nothing else. No company logo. No return address. Just my name. Did Olivia send you? I asked quietly. Mason answered almost immediately. No. His response came too quickly to sound rehearsed, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Does she know you are here? This time he did not respond right away. He looked down the hallway before saying, Not yet. Those two words unsettled me far more than I expected. Olivia had always supported my company. She celebrated every contract, every milestone, every employee we hired. She spent countless weekends listening to practice presentations and reminding me not to underestimate myself before important meetings. At least that was what I believed. My mind drifted back to 10 years earlier when Walker Dynamics was nothing more than an idea sketched across a legal pad at our kitchen table. We lived in a small apartment on the north side of Chicago with outdated appliances and furniture bought from garage sales. Olivia worked as a marketing coordinator while I freelanced as a software consultant during the day and built my own platform every night. We measured success in tiny victories. A new client meant we could pay rent without worrying. A profitable quarter meant replacing an old computer instead of repairing it again. Every achievement felt shared because we sacrificed together. Around that same time, Mason had graduated from college. He struggled to find stable work and quietly admitted one evening that he was falling behind on rent. I never saw him as a burden. I simply told him to pack his belongings and move into our guest room until he got back on his feet. 5 months turned into almost half a year, but I never regretted helping him. We shared dinners, watched football on Sundays, and joked that one day he would tell people he lived with a startup founder before anyone knew the company's name. When he finally landed a job, I celebrated as if he were my own younger brother. Standing in that hallway now, it felt impossible to connect those memories with the man in front of me holding an envelope that seemed capable of changing everything. Mason, I said carefully, have you come here to help me or to stop me? His answer came with remarkable honesty. I came here because I could not keep pretending everything was fine. Before I could ask another question, the conference room door opened slightly behind me. Sarah Collins stepped into the hallway with her usual calm expression. Ethan, she said gently, the investors are willing to wait a few more minutes, but they are starting to wonder if this meeting should continue today. I glanced back toward the conference room, then at the USB drive still resting in Mason's hand. Somehow I understood that the next decision I made would define far more than the future of my company. It would reveal the kind of person I chose to be when the ground beneath my feet suddenly began to shift. I looked at Sarah for a moment before answering. Please let everyone know I will be back in 2 minutes. She studied my face carefully, then gave a small nod and returned to the conference room without asking another question. As soon as the door closed again, I turned back to Mason. You have exactly 2 minutes. He handed me the envelope first instead of the USB drive. Read this later, he said quietly. The drive is more important right now. I accepted both without opening either one. You still have not answered my question. Mason took a slow breath. You have spent years believing I owed you everything. I frowned. You never owed me anything. He shook his head. That is exactly why this is so difficult. His words pulled me back through years of memories I had not visited in a long time. I remembered helping him prepare for job interviews after he moved out of our house. I spent evenings reviewing his resume line by line, introducing him to business contacts, and coaching him before meetings because I genuinely wanted him to succeed. When he finally received an offer from a respected logistics company, he hugged me in my driveway and promised that one day he would repay my kindness. I laughed and told him there was nothing to repay. Family was supposed to help each other. That belief had guided almost every important decision I made in my adult life. Olivia often teased me for trusting people too easily. She would smile while saying, "One day someone is going to take advantage of your optimism." I always answered the same way. If I stop believing in people, I lose the best part of myself. Looking back, I realized I had repeated those words so often that they became part of my identity. Even as Walker Dynamics grew from 3 employees to nearly 80, I tried to build the company around trust instead of fear. Everyone knew our financial reports were transparent. Every manager had an open-door policy. Birthdays were celebrated. Family emergencies came before deadlines. I believed that when people felt respected, they did their best work. That philosophy helped us earn loyal clients and talented employees. It also made me believe the people closest to me shared the same values. Mason interrupted my thoughts with a quiet voice. "Ethan, whatever happens after you look at that drive, please remember one thing." I crossed my arms. "What?" "Not everyone who keeps a secret is trying to hurt you." I searched his expression again. He looked exhausted, as though he had not slept in days. There were dark circles beneath his eyes, and his usually confident posture had disappeared. Whatever had brought him here had clearly weighed on him for a long time. "Then why keep it secret at all?" I asked. "Because I kept convincing myself someone else would tell you first." His answer lingered between us. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated. The screen showed a text message from Olivia. It was short. "Good luck today. I know you are going to do great. Love you." I stared at those words longer than I expected. They looked exactly like every encouraging message she had sent before important meetings. Warm, supportive, familiar. Nothing about them suggested that anything unusual was happening. I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. Mason noticed the message but said nothing. He simply looked away toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Outside, the city moved exactly as it always had. Traffic flowed through the intersections. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Somewhere below, a train rolled across elevated tracks with its familiar metallic rhythm. The world continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening, while my own life seemed to be standing perfectly still. I finally placed the USB drive inside my jacket pocket. "I am going back into that room," I said. "Those investors deserve the presentation I promised them." Mason nodded slowly. "I hoped you would say that." I looked at him one last time before reaching for the conference room door. "When this meeting is over," I said calmly, "you and I are going to sit down together. You are going to tell me everything from the beginning. No more half answers. No more waiting." He met my eyes and quietly replied, "I will. And once you know the whole story, you will understand why walking into that room today was the hardest decision I have ever made." When I walked back into the conference room, every conversation stopped. 22 investors looked in my direction, not because they were impatient, but because they were waiting to see what I would do next. I placed the presentation remote back into my hand, smiled politely, and said, "Thank you for your patience. I appreciate your understanding. I would like to continue where we left off." Richard Bennett gave a slight nod. "Please do." There was no irritation in his voice, only quiet curiosity. I understood exactly what was happening. The presentation was no longer the only thing being evaluated. Every decision I made from that point forward was becoming part of my presentation as well. I took a slow breath and advanced to the next slide. It showed our 5-year expansion strategy, projected revenue, customer growth, and operational milestones. Normally, this would have been the highlight of my presentation. Instead, I could feel everyone studying my composure as much as the numbers on the screen. Surprisingly, the anxiety I expected never arrived. My thoughts became remarkably clear. I explained each projection carefully, answered every question directly, and never once glanced toward the conference room door. Whatever waited inside the USB drive could not be changed during the next 30 minutes. The only thing I could control was the way I honored the commitment I had made to everyone sitting in front of me. Sarah Collins noticed the shift almost immediately. She smiled slightly as I answered a detailed question about long-term operating costs. One investor asked about supply chain risks. Another questioned our hiring strategy if demand doubled within 18 months. A third wanted clarification on licensing agreements. Each answer came naturally because I knew this business better than anyone else. I had built every process, negotiated every early contract, and learned every lesson through years of mistakes and persistence. As the meeting continued, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal. People leaned forward again. Pens moved across notebooks. Tablets displayed financial models instead of curious expressions. Richard Bennett finally closed his folder and rested both hands on the table. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I have attended investment meetings for over 25 years. Unexpected situations happen more often than people realize. What interests me is not the interruption itself. It is how a founder responds to it." I listened quietly. "You could have canceled this meeting. You could have become defensive. Instead, you stayed focused. That tells us something important about your leadership." I thanked him, but kept my response brief. Compliments felt strange while the unanswered questions waiting outside the room grew heavier by the minute. Still, I refused to let my attention drift. Nearly 40 minutes after returning, I reached my final slide. Instead of discussing projected profits, it displayed a simple statement that had guided Walker Dynamics since the beginning. "Trust is earned through consistency." I looked around the room before speaking one last time. Technology changes quickly. Markets change quickly. Competition changes quickly. The one thing I believe should never change is the way people treat one another while building something meaningful. Every number you have seen today represents real employees, real customers, and real families who trusted us to keep our promises. When I finished, the room remained silent for a moment before several investors began applauding. It was not loud or dramatic. It was respectful. Richard Bennett stood and extended his hand across the table. "Thank you, Ethan. We still have internal discussions ahead, but I believe today has been very productive." One by one, the investors gathered their materials, exchanged business cards with members of my team, and quietly left the conference room. Sarah waited until the last guest disappeared into the hallway before walking over to me. "You handled that better than I expected," she said softly. I smiled, but it did not reach my eyes. "I am not sure the hardest part has started yet." She followed my gaze toward the closed conference room door. "The young man is still waiting." I looked through the glass wall into the reception area. Mason had not moved from the chair where I left him. The black USB drive was no longer in his hand because it rested inside my jacket pocket, but the sealed envelope remained on the table beside him. He sat quietly with both hands folded together, looking like someone who had accepted that there was no turning back. I gathered my notebook, switched off the projector, and picked up my jacket. As my fingers brushed against the small USB drive inside the pocket, I realized that for the first time all morning, I was no longer worried about whether investors would believe in my company. I was about to discover whether I still understood the people I believed knew me best. The conference room was empty by the time I stepped into the reception area. Mason stood as soon as he saw me, but neither of us spoke immediately. Sarah quietly gathered the remaining presentation materials before giving me a reassuring nod. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I will tell the staff you are unavailable for the rest of the afternoon." I thanked her, then turned toward Mason. "There is a small meeting room down the hall." He nodded and followed me without saying a word. Once the door closed behind us, the silence felt completely different from the silence inside the investor meeting. This was personal. I placed my jacket on the chair, removed the USB drive from the pocket, and set it on the table between us. "Start from the beginning," I said calmly. "No guessing, no assumptions, just facts." Mason leaned forward with both hands resting on his knees. "Before you look at the files, I need you to know something. I never wanted to become part of this." I looked directly at him. "Then tell me why you are." He inhaled slowly before answering. "About 3 months ago, Olivia asked me for help. At first, I thought it was something simple. She said she needed someone she could trust to review documents because she did not want to worry you while you were preparing for this investment round." My heart sank, but I remained silent. Mason continued. "She asked me to organize files, compare contracts, and keep copies of certain emails. She told me it was only temporary." I glanced down at the USB drive without touching it. What changed? Mason's expression became heavier. I started reading the documents. The room fell quiet again. "And?" I asked. The more I read, the less everything made sense. He slowly pushed the USB drive toward me. "Everything you need is on there. I copied only the files directly related to your company. I did not change anything. I did not delete anything. I only saved copies because I was afraid the originals might disappear." I reached into my laptop bag, removed my computer, and connected the drive. For a few seconds, the screen remained blank before several folders appeared. Each folder was organized by date. There were email archives, financial spreadsheets, scanned agreements, and internal planning documents. Everything looked professionally organized. Nothing appeared suspicious at first glance. I opened the first folder. It contained email conversations between Olivia and an outside business consultant whose name I did not recognize. They discussed potential restructuring options if new investors joined the company. That alone was not unusual. Founders and spouses often discussed future planning. I opened another folder. There were draft agreements that had never been shown to me. One document proposed creating a separate consulting company that would provide management services to Walker Dynamics after the investment closed. Another outlined future compensation structures that included names I had never approved. I looked up at Mason. Who prepared these? That is what worried me, he answered quietly. Some documents listed your company. Some listed outside firms. None of them included your signature. I continued reading. The deeper I went, the more confused I became. There were conversations about future business strategies, but nothing suggested stolen money, fraud, or criminal activity. Instead, everything pointed toward decisions being discussed without my knowledge. Important decisions. Decisions that would shape the future of the company I had spent 10 years building. Why would Olivia keep this from me? I whispered more to myself than to Mason. He slowly shook his head. I asked her the same question. What did she say? Mason looked down at the table before answering. She believed she was protecting you from unnecessary stress before the investment meeting. She kept saying that once the funding was secured, everyone would sit down together and explain everything. I leaned back in my chair, trying to organize my thoughts. Olivia had always believed in planning every detail before presenting solutions. She disliked unfinished conversations and avoided creating conflict whenever possible. That part sounded like her. But keeping months of discussions about my own company hidden from me crossed a line I never imagined she would cross. I closed the laptop without saying anything. The room became completely still. Mason finally reached into his jacket and gently placed the sealed envelope in front of me. I think you should read this now, he said softly. I turned the envelope over in my hands before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line immediately caught my attention. It began with only 6 simple words. Ethan, I hope you can forgive me. My hands remained perfectly still as I unfolded the letter, but inside I felt something I had not experienced in years. It was not anger. It was uncertainty. Olivia had always preferred writing difficult conversations before speaking them aloud. Even when we were newly married, she would leave handwritten notes on the kitchen counter whenever she struggled to explain something face to face. That familiar handwriting immediately brought back countless ordinary mornings filled with coffee, hurried breakfasts, and simple reminders telling me to have a good day. I took a slow breath and began reading. Ethan, I hope you can forgive me. If you are reading this, it means Mason finally decided to do what I could not. I know this feels like betrayal, but please believe that every decision I made began with the intention of protecting you. Even if I now understand that protecting someone by hiding the truth only creates a different kind of pain. I stopped reading for a moment and looked toward the window. Downtown Chicago stretched across the afternoon sunlight exactly as it had an hour earlier, but everything inside me felt different. I continued. Olivia explained that nearly 6 months earlier, several experienced consultants had approached her privately after learning that Walker Dynamics was preparing for a major investment round. They believed the company had grown faster than our internal management systems could support. They recommended building a long-term executive advisory structure before outside investors demanded one themselves. Olivia admitted she had listened to them because she feared I would reject every suggestion immediately. She knew how protective I was of the company because every department, every employee, and every process represented years of sacrifice. She wrote that she wanted to prepare options first, then present complete solutions after the investment meeting instead of creating unnecessary distractions beforehand. She believed she was reducing pressure. Instead, she had unknowingly created distance between us. I lowered the letter and quietly asked Mason, "Did you know all of this from the beginning?" He nodded slowly. At first, yes. I believed she was simply organizing future planning. But then I realized the discussions continued for months without you knowing anything. That never felt right. I looked back at the laptop. None of the documents suggested anyone had stolen company funds. No fraudulent accounts existed. There were no hidden transfers or illegal agreements. Instead, there were recommendations, draft proposals, and strategic conversations that involved my future without my participation. Somehow that realization hurt more than discovering financial dishonesty would have. Money can be replaced. Trust is much harder to rebuild. I finished reading the final page. Olivia ended the letter by asking only one thing. She asked me not to judge her intentions before allowing her to explain every decision herself. There were no excuses, no attempts to blame anyone else. Only an acknowledgement that keeping secrets had damaged the partnership we had spent more than a decade building together. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the laptop. Neither Mason nor I spoke for several moments. Finally, I broke the silence. "Have you talked to her today?" He shook his head. "No. She does not know I came here." "Does she know you copied these files?" "No." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes briefly. The strange part was that I still recognized the woman described in the letter. Olivia had always believed preparation solved problems. She planned vacations 6 months ahead. She organized holiday dinners with color-coded lists. She researched every major purchase before spending a single dollar. In her mind, waiting until everything was complete probably felt responsible. In mine, marriage had always meant facing uncertainty together, even when no perfect solution existed. Those two beliefs had quietly drifted apart without either of us noticing. My phone vibrated once again. This time it was another message from Olivia. "How did the meeting go? I have been thinking about you all day." I stared at the screen for several seconds before locking it without replying. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I realized this conversation deserved more than a few sentences typed into a phone. It deserved honesty, patience, and the courage both of us had somehow forgotten to practice. I slipped the letter back into its envelope, disconnected the USB drive from my laptop, and stood up. Mason looked at me carefully, almost afraid to ask what I planned to do next. I picked up my jacket and calmly said, "I am going home. It is time to hear the rest of the story from the only person who can finish telling it." The drive home felt longer than any commute I could remember. Chicago traffic moved at its usual pace, but my thoughts refused to settle. Every red light gave me another minute to replay the documents I had just seen, and every green light reminded me that I was getting closer to a conversation that would probably change my marriage forever. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was not preparing for an argument. I was preparing to understand how two people who had trusted each other for more than a decade had quietly stopped sharing the same conversations. When I pulled into the driveway, Olivia's car was already there. The kitchen lights were on, and through the front window, I could see her setting the dinner table as though it were an ordinary weekday evening. For a brief moment, I simply remained in the driver's seat, looking at the familiar home we had built together. Every flower bed had been planted by Olivia. Every tree in the backyard had been chosen together during one spring weekend years ago. This house was filled with ordinary memories that suddenly felt much more valuable than business projections or investment meetings. I finally stepped inside. Olivia looked up immediately and smiled with genuine relief. "You are home," she said. "I have been waiting to hear how everything went." Her smile slowly faded when she noticed the expression on my face. "Ethan, what happened?" I placed my jacket over the back of a chair and quietly laid the sealed envelope and USB drive on the kitchen table between us. She stared at them without moving. The color slowly left her face. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "Mason came to see you." It was not a question. I nodded once. "He did." She closed her eyes briefly and took a slow breath before sitting down. I remained standing, not because I wanted to create distance, but because I was afraid that if I interrupted too quickly, we would both start defending ourselves instead of listening. Olivia looked at the envelope again. "Did you read it?" "Every word." "And the files?" "Yes." She folded her hands together. "Then I suppose there is nothing left to hide." Her voice carried sadness rather than fear. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I do not want to spend tonight accusing you," I said calmly. "I want to understand something much simpler." She looked directly into my eyes. "What is that? Why did you believe everyone else needed to know about my company's future before I did?" She lowered her gaze to the table. "Because I convinced myself that I was helping." I waited without interrupting. Every consultant I spoke with kept telling me the same thing. They said your company had become too important to rely on one person's decisions. They believed you needed a stronger executive structure before outside investors demanded one. At first I disagreed with them. Then I started wondering if they were right. She paused before continuing. I knew how much pressure you were already carrying. Every time I tried to imagine telling you that strangers were questioning your leadership, I pictured you losing focus before the biggest presentation of your career. I thought if I could organize everything first, you would see complete solutions instead of unfinished problems. I listened carefully. But somewhere along the way, she continued, I stopped preparing information for us and started making decisions around you instead of with you. Those words settled quietly between us. They sounded painfully honest. I nodded slowly. That is exactly what hurt. Olivia looked up again, her eyes filled with regret. I know, and I did not realize how far I had crossed that line until Mason told me he could not keep the secret anymore. I leaned back in my chair. He said he hoped someone else would tell me first. She gave a small, sorrowful smile. He kept asking me every week if I had talked to you. Every week I told him I would after one more meeting, one more draft, one more revision. Eventually, there was always one more reason to wait. We both sat quietly as the evening sunlight faded through the kitchen windows. The silence no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. For the first time in months, neither of us was protecting the other with carefully chosen words. We were simply facing the truth together, however uncomfortable it happened to be. Then Olivia reached into the drawer beside the refrigerator and placed a thick blue folder on the table. There is one more thing, she said softly. I think you should see everything before you decide what comes next. For several seconds, neither of us reached for the blue folder resting between us. It sat there quietly on the kitchen table like a conversation that had been postponed for far too long. Olivia finally slid it toward me with both hands. Everything is in there, she said. Every proposal, every consultant report, every draft agreement. I promised myself that once the investment meeting was over, I would hand you this folder and we would decide together what to do next. I never imagined Mason would come to your office first. I slowly opened the folder. Inside were neatly organized documents separated by colored tabs. Olivia had always been meticulous. Every page was dated. Every meeting summary included notes. Every recommendation had been highlighted with comments written in the margins. The first report came from an independent management consulting firm that specialized in helping rapidly growing technology companies. Their assessment surprised me. They praised our culture, customer satisfaction, and financial discipline. But they also warned that too many major decisions depended on one person. That person was me. According to their analysis, Walker Dynamics had reached a point where sustainable growth required stronger executive planning, clearer succession strategies, and additional leadership support. None of those recommendations were unreasonable. In fact, I had considered several of them myself over the years, but always postponed them because there never seemed to be enough time. I continued reading. The next section contained Olivia's handwritten notes. She had challenged several consultant recommendations, crossed out unnecessary expenses, and repeatedly wrote the same sentence beside multiple pages. Ethan must approve every final decision. I stopped reading and looked at her. You wrote this. She nodded quietly. Every single time. I turned several more pages. She was telling the truth. Although meetings had taken place without me, every draft eventually circled back to the same handwritten reminder. No agreement was to become final without my approval. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She had absolutely been wrong to keep these discussions from me, but she had never intended to remove me from the company I built. She had been trying, in her own imperfect way, to prepare possibilities instead of making permanent choices. Why did you never simply ask me to sit in one of those meetings? I asked. Olivia smiled sadly. Because I kept waiting for the perfect moment. Then your investor presentation became more important. Then another client contract. Then another hiring decision. Every week, I believed waiting one more week would make the conversation easier. She looked down at her hands. Instead, waiting made everything harder. Her words sounded painfully familiar. How many times had I postponed family dinners because of business travel? How many weekends had I promised to slow down after just one more project? We had both spent years believing we were protecting our future while quietly creating distance in the present. At that moment, my phone rang. The caller was Richard Bennett. I answered after excusing myself for a moment. Good evening, Richard. His voice was calm as always. I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all. I wanted to let you know our preliminary discussion has already taken place. The partners were impressed today. I thanked him politely, but remained cautious. We were especially impressed, he continued, by how you handled unexpected pressure without losing focus. Technical skills can be taught. Character is much harder to find. I remained silent, listening carefully. We still have formal procedures ahead, Richard added, but I would like to schedule another meeting next week. I believe there is a strong foundation for moving forward. After we ended the call, I stood quietly for several moments before returning to the kitchen table. Olivia looked at me with uncertainty. Was that one of the investors? I nodded. They want another meeting. Relief briefly crossed her face before fading again. I am glad, she whispered. I sat down across from her once more. Today could have ended very differently, I said. If Mason had remained silent, I would have walked into future decisions without understanding what had been happening. If he had interrupted for the wrong reasons, the investors might have lost confidence. Somehow none of those things happened. Olivia slowly nodded. He chose honesty, even though it meant disappointing both of us. I looked toward the front window where the evening lights reflected across the neighborhood. Tomorrow, I said quietly, the three of us need to sit down together. Not to decide who was right or wrong, but to decide how we move forward without secrets. Olivia reached across the table and gently closed the blue folder. I would like that, she answered softly. Because if we are going to rebuild trust, it has to begin with every conversation we were too afraid to have. The next evening, the three of us gathered around the same kitchen table where so many important conversations had been delayed for far too long. Mason arrived carrying nothing except a notebook and a quiet determination to answer every remaining question. There were no envelopes, no USB drives, and no hidden documents left between us. For the first time since this unexpected chapter had begun, everything that needed to be said could finally be spoken openly. Mason looked at both of us before taking a slow breath. I owe both of you an apology, he began. I should have pushed harder for honesty months ago instead of hoping the situation would somehow solve itself. Olivia gently shook her head. No, I was the one who kept asking for more time. Every delay was my decision. I listened without interrupting. Blame no longer seemed useful. What mattered now was understanding how we could prevent silence from replacing trust ever again. We spent nearly 3 hours talking through every meeting, every consultant recommendation, and every conversation that had taken place without me. By the end of the evening, there were no unanswered questions left. We agreed that Walker Dynamics would move forward with an independent advisory board, but every major decision would be reviewed together by the leadership team instead of being discussed privately through separate conversations. Transparency would no longer be an ideal we talked about in presentations. It would become the way we operated both inside the company and inside our family. A week later, I walked back into the same conference room where everything had seemed ready to fall apart. Richard Bennett and the investment partners welcomed me with the same professionalism they had shown from the beginning. This meeting felt different. There were no unexpected interruptions, no unanswered questions waiting outside the door, and no distractions competing for my attention. After several hours of discussion, Richard smiled and slid a folder across the table. We are pleased to move forward, he said. Not because your company is perfect, but because you demonstrated something every investor hopes to find. When unexpected challenges appeared, you chose honesty over panic and patience over impulse. I accepted the folder with genuine gratitude. The funding would allow Walker Dynamics to expand into several new markets, hire additional engineers, and continue building the products we had envisioned for years. Yet as important as that achievement was, it no longer felt like the greatest victory of that season. The real success had happened at home, around a kitchen table where difficult conversations finally replaced comfortable silence. Over the following months, Olivia and I slowly rebuilt the habits we had once taken for granted. We stopped assuming we understood each other's thoughts without asking. Every Friday evening became our time to review both company matters and family plans together, not because we needed formal meetings, but because we never wanted important conversations to drift into secrecy again. Mason also found a new sense of peace. Although he admitted he had feared losing both his sister and his brother-in-law by telling the truth, the opposite happened. Our relationship became stronger because it was finally built on honesty instead of avoidance. Looking back now, I often think about that conference room door opening at the exact moment my presentation reached its most important point. At the time, I believed someone had arrived to destroy everything I had spent 10 years creating. Instead, that unexpected interruption exposed a problem that could have quietly grown far more damaging if nobody had spoken up. Sometimes the greatest threat to a family or a business is not conflict itself. It is the belief that difficult conversations can always wait until tomorrow. I learned that trust is not protected by hiding uncomfortable truths. It is strengthened when people have the courage to face those truths together with respect, patience, and honesty. Whenever new employees ask me what the most important leadership lesson of my career has been, they usually expect me to mention strategy, investment, or innovation. I simply smile and tell them something much simpler. The strongest foundations are not built by avoiding hard conversations. They are built by having them before silence becomes the loudest voice in the room. That lesson changed my company, restored my marriage, strengthened my family, and became the most valuable investment I have ever made.